Good evening, everyone. I'm sure you have all been at home watching cable news, frantically refreshing election returns, and we're proud to be bringing you something completely different. Some levity, some musical theater, some Shakespeare for an hour on the Shakespeare Hour Live. Hello, I am Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg and literary manager. And before we get started, I'd just like to thank a few of our sponsors. Tonight's episode has been generously supported by Sarah and Stephen Kraskin. Thank you, Sarah and Stephen. And the Shakespeare Hour is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is made possible by the support of the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Also, as you all know from last week's show, Simon Godwin, our beloved AD, is in London filming his production of Romeo and Juliet at the National Theatre. Simon started rehearsals this week. I think today's day 3 or day 4, and we wish him and his whole team at the NT the best of luck as they start this journey on their new project. Though Simon wasn't able to join us tonight, we will be hearing from him in a special video later in the episode. As I said at the top, tonight we are discussing Shakespeare and musical theater. This has been a frequently requested topic since we started doing the Shakespeare Hour. I think this is week 24, and we've had 24 weeks of requests to talk about Shakespeare and musicals. And it's my pleasure to introduce our extremely esteemed panel of guests. First, Ted Chapin, President and Chief Creative Officer of the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization and co-founder of Encores at New York City Center. Ted, are you there?
I'm here.
And where are you zooming in from tonight, Ted?
I'm actually zooming in from Chester, Connecticut, an old house that we've had for a number of years. And I have to say, I am one who escaped New York in March and have gone back from time to time, but rather like watching the seasons change here and walking my dogs in the local state forests. What can I say?
Yeah, so it's a season of Arcadian renewal for you, being in touch with nature.
That's a good way to put it. You are a Shakespeare theater. That's a good way to put it.
Well, thank you, Ted, for joining us. Also joining us is Tony Award-winning Ben Davis, whose Broadway credits include Dear Evan Hansen, Les Miserables, who is also drinking wine tonight off camera, and who starred as Petruchio in Kiss Me Kate at the Royal Albert Hall for the BBC Proms in 2014. Ben, sorry to blow you up there. Are you with us?
Yes, and I'm going to be drinking wine on camera as well, but because it's still the election and it's COVID.
Exactly. And are you joining us from New York tonight?
I'm in New York. I'm in the financial district, just a couple blocks south of the World Trade Center.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're excited to hear your thoughts.
I'm so happy to be here with everybody. I love everybody that's on this panel, so it's a lot of fun.
Also joining us is Natasha Diaz, 3-time Helen Hayes Award winner with numerous Broadway, off-Broadway, and DC area credits. She is also known for her role in the national tour of West Side Story and the Broadway documentary Every Little Step. Natasha, are you with us?
I am so with you, Drew. Like, I couldn't be any more with you. I'm so with you.
Yes, we hear you crystal clear with your wonderful
my fancy microphone, so I can be felt and heard as well as we can in the Zoom land, in the magical Zoom land. Make that connection.
And you're calling us from DC, is that correct?
I am in Virginia, yes.
Holding it down in Northern Virginia.
That's right. Watching the seasons change. So I have to say it's true, being able to be quarantined and then sort of stuck at home in a place where you can be outside is I feel very fortunate. Been really, really, really lucky.
And you and Ted were talking before we started Zooming about how you have a connection, is that right? Something about your family?
I don't know, Ted.
Yeah, yes. Well, I've been doing a little bit of a deep dive before this because one always wants to sound up on everything. And I looked at Natasha's wonderful website and realized that she is the daughter of Justino Diaz, who, although this isn't Shakespeare, but performed South Pacific at the New York City Opera, I believe, under Beverly Sills, and made a recording of it, I think, as well. But I suddenly thought the world is smaller than you think.
Oh, yes, yes. And that's funny because the association I thought you were going to say was Leonard Bernstein's Mass.
Oh.
He sang the opening of the Kennedy Center.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Small world, and you're never too far from DC.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the side of the Kennedy Center says it all, you know?
Truly is a small world. So yeah, hopefully we'll make more of these connections over the course of the hour. Last but not least, it is my pleasure, my thrill to introduce our special guest co-host for tonight's episode, Mr. Alan Paul, the Associate Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theater Company and our resident expert in musical theater. Alan, are you with us?
Drew, I am so with you right now. And so excited to finally be asked about musical theater.
No, it's something that you don't get a chance to talk about enough, frankly.
And the very specific subgenre of Shakespeare and musical theater. So,
and are you joining us from one of your many manses on the East Coast? Where are you in the world?
I'm joining you from Logan Circle in the heart of DC, and I've spent the day walking around DC, which is very quiet and feels very normal.
So quiet. In fact, my wife and I went to DuPont Circle for lunch today. Kind of spookily quiet, eerily quiet a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, Alan, I think it would be best to start maybe with you talking about our topic tonight, Shakespeare and musical theater. Our guiding question for the hour is, what are the similarities between Shakespeare and musicals? Obviously, Shakespeare's plays in some ways were the equivalent of the Broadway musical, a commercial entertainment with songs, with dance. But why do you think they're so frequently adapted into musicals? What are the similarities and what are the differences? And are there any that you would like to highlight or praise as particular masterpieces of the genre?
Well, we're going to get to this in the second half of the program, but I think there are so many great adaptations of Shakespeare in musicals, but the three that come to mind, and especially with this group of people, are first The Boys from Syracuse, written by Rodgers and Hart, which premiered in '38, and which oddly enough is the tie that binds this group, because Ben and Natasha were in a concert we did at the theater maybe 10 years ago, and I was lucky to have Ted come and see that. And 10 years later, of course, in 1948 is Kiss Me, Kate, which is a very different kind of a golden age musical. And then 1957, of course, is West Side Story, which, is very different from those two and is a kind of an emissary of what the future of musical theater would be. But I think when you think of Shakespeare, you think of a popular playwright writing for a big public. And I think that what all these shows have in common is that they were meant to be great entertainment. And they were at a time when Broadway was just the epicenter of culture. And I think it is no mistake that when you look at Boys from Syracuse and you see a song like This Can't Be Love, I mean, these were the popular songs of the day. You look at Ella Fitzgerald's recording of Too Darn Hot from Kiss Me, Kate. And then, of course, West Side Story was a piece that things are less taken out of context, but I think Somewhere is one of the most recorded songs out there. And so I think the other thing that these shows have in common with Shakespeare is that Shakespeare was writing about a whole world of people. You see every level of society in each of his pieces. And all of these shows have that too. And I think the other piece, Drew, that you mentioned is that Shakespeare is so musical. And these, of course, are musicals, but dance plays a huge role in all three of these pieces. And they have three really important choreographers attached to them. Of course, Balanchine for The Boys from Syracuse, I think. Hanya Holm, who is a name you might not know, but was the choreographer of Kiss Me, Kate and many of the classic Golden Age musicals. And of course, Jerome Robbins. So I'm excited to see what the group has to say about all those things as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the sort of historicization of these three pieces. And I was looking at them yesterday. In some ways, Boys is right before the emergence of the so-called book musical, I believe, with Oklahoma.
Well, yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing as a director is, and Oklahoma, we talk a lot about how songs move the story forward in a way they hadn't before. And I can remember directing The Boys from Syracuse, which has some songs that actually do move the story forward. But a lot of times you say to the actor involved, This is about savoring the moment. And there's a lot to savor there.
Yeah, so they're each sort of different dramaturgically in some ways. Kiss Me Kate is a perfect book musical. West Side Story is operatic, it's ballaic, it's almost pre-rock and roll in this way where it's at the center of pop culture, as you're saying. Also, I want to give you a shout out, Natasha, from our commenter Chuck. OMG, Justino Diaz, one of my idols in college.
Yay! Wow.
So back on topic, of course, these musicals are now entering the classical canon in their own right, being performed at theaters such as Oregon Shakespeare Festival and Stratford and STC. So Ted, obviously you are involved with the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate. How do you think of specifically Shakespearean musical theater works and what distinguishes them, or how do you come to this conversation?
Well, I think I've been saying for years when people talk about the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows that they're really good stories. And I think, and if there are only 3 or 4 stories in the world that get rewritten, Shakespeare knew that too. So that to go into the complexities of Shakespeare's plays and pull, so often people will just pull an idea out or 3 ideas or put things together. I mean, that the Lion King has Hamlet, as one of the underbellies is kind of astonishing, because I don't think perhaps anybody who sees the Lion King thinks that, unless Shakespearean scholars who can say, wait a minute, I get the parallels. So I think that's, I think that's part of the reason. I will confess that I've always been a musical theater enthusiast. When I was in college, I waited till the last possible moment to take a Shakespeare class, because I just thought to myself, I do not want somebody telling me these are the greatest plays ever written. And so I did. I waited till my senior year of college, and I had a terrible teacher who just, actually, I think you'll be amused by this. I decided to write a paper on Hamlet. We were supposed to write a play, we read a play, we write a paper, we get suggested topics, or we could think of our own topics. So I wrote a paper about Hamlet, and I said, a work of theater has to be able to make sense in the 2 hours or 2.5 hours given to experience it. And you can't in Hamlet. It's much too complicated. You have to keep going back and back and back. Therefore, it's not that great a play. It's a great piece of literature, but it's not that great a play. This gentleman, I still have the paper somewhere, said, this paper strikes me as a Philistine cop-out. So that's my shit. But I will say, my grandmother took me to the Stratford Festival in Ontario when I was a teenager. And the 3 Shakespeare shows that I saw at Stratford, and it was in the sort of late 60s heyday, and they were just mind-blowing productions. So I've always loved Shakespeare. I think the musical theater has been indebted to it in wonderful ways that we will get to talk about later.
Well, your theory about Hamlet, I should say, Ted, is one that I've heard from many practitioners and directors who think it is an unstageable play, at least as written, and that you must do a cut of it, or that it was not written for performance. So, I disagree with your old professor. I don't think it's a Philistine cop-out at all. Natasha, you have experience you were in our production of Measure for Measure at the Shakespeare Theater Company. You've done many musicals. Do these similarities and differences strike you? One thing that Ted mentioned that I think is true is that I think American musical theater makers adapt Shakespeare as a way of making Shakespeare their own, retelling Shakespeare in their own idiomatic cultural language, rather than adhering to some kind of foreign notion of what Shakespeare should be, right? Shakespeare must be for us, therefore we make him into, Cole Porter or Leonard Bernstein.
So what do you mean when you say foreign? What would that be?
I think this idea Ted was talking about, that Shakespeare is something handed down from on high, that you are told is good, and is culture that you must aspire to, whereas musical theater, at least at one point, was the lingua franca of just American culture, right? It was something as natural as speaking or singing.
Right. It's interesting. I have always felt, I wish that I could do more Shakespeare. I've always wanted to do more. I feel like there is a size, there is a liftedness to the metaphor, the poetry, in Shakespeare that is, like Alan said, it is similar to the stance of the purpose of a song in when a song comes along in a musical. And I always say this to people I'm coaching or teaching or in discussions like this. I think this concept often gets forgotten in musicals nowadays. And I think when they're most successful is when they adhere to this formula. In musicals, when the truth of a moment becomes too much for the character to hold, and it can no longer be spoken, the character bursts into song. Because it's exploded, right? The affect has become too much to hold and it must live in a place of music. And then further, when even song, the note and music can no longer contain the heat of this affect of the moment, then it bursts into dance. You go into a place without words. It just becomes, it goes, you can't even express it there, but the point of departure is always the truth of the moment. And whenever we get disconnected from that formula is when you go, I don't know why I'm watching this, or I'm not feeling something, or and I think more often than not, it gets forgotten. And when you get taken away by a moment of joy or expansion, a musical expansion in a musical, it is that. Well, for my money and where I try to aim is that is where you live with text. That is where you live in Shakespeare's text. There is even the way your intention with how you breathe, there is, you know what you're going to say. You don't like discover or break up lines. There is an intention when you breathe, and there's a phrase that comes out. And the shapes, the sounds. It's funny, I'm remembering from Carousel, the way we were taught, the way we were as an ensemble. It's so similar. All of a sudden, the crystallization of sounds, an ah sound or an o sound. And when the clipped comes, it all is purposeful. And Shakespeare put all of those musical textures purposefully in these lines, much as a great Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. When you walk down the aisle, all the heads will turn. What a rustling of bonnets there'll be, right? It all, and Shakespeare has that. So in that it's lifted, and the poetry is intentional. I feel like those are similarities, and they ought to both be as anchored into truth and expanded grandly as the other. One is the other.
Yeah, this phenomenon of bursting into song when the emotion motivates the character, it seems to be a correlative, or the same thing that happens in a Shakespeare play when you shift suddenly from prose into verse. And the power that Shakespeare's language has is not dissimilar to the power that a Bernstein or a Cole Porter or a Rodgers and Hart or Rodgers and Hammerstein song has in that moment. Ben, I wonder if you agree, or if Natasha's passionate words and performance stirs something in your soul as a practitioner.
I mean, she stole my answer. I mean, no, I was going to say that, but I also think that it's simpler than that. I think Shakespeare utilized music a lot in the performance of his plays. So I think it's very natural. And I think even if you go before musicals, if you go to opera, there's Othello, there's Hamlet, there's all these, it's these bigger stories that are bigger than life. And that's, but also tell the very stories of who we are as humans. And I think that's what the best that musical theater can do is tell stories that are larger than life about very simple human dramas And I think that that's what Shakespeare did. And I think that his language is heightened, and musical theater language is heightened. So I think that it plays into it very easily. I was very fortunate to work with a actor director named Kenneth Branagh and Alan Paul. But Branagh had done Love's Labor Lost, which as a musical, and whether it was successful or not is subjective. But the fact that he said, "Oh, well, this is a natural thing that we can do," in the very vein of Kiss Me Kate or West Side Story or Boys from Syracuse, I think that it's just it seems natural to me. It's these big epic stories that can be told through music.
We actually mentioned the Branagh Love's Labors, I believe. No, we mentioned his As You Like It in our episode on Shakespeare in Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually have a question from an audience member. Michael McMurphy wonders, do we know how much music Shakespeare introduced into his productions back in the 1600s? And a question for Alan from Terry, could you talk a little bit about your process turning Comedy of Errors when you directed it at the Shakespeare Theater into a musical? Because you have also sort of specialized, Alan, in directing Shakespeare's plays and musicalizing them to a certain extent. I also think of your Romeo and Juliet as being quite similar to musical theater.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you, Terry. It's odd because I love the Boys from Syracuse, and we only had about 5 days with it. So we didn't have the chance to really do much of anything except for get some very basic staging up. But I love the piece, and I think it's so ripe for a revival. And, for those of you that don't know, I'm a twin. So when you talk about these plays like 12th Night or The Boys from Syracuse, where being a twin might not mean something to other people, I really understand what those final recognition scenes are about. And so I would say I did not have a huge epiphany directing The Boys from Syracuse, but directing The Boys from Syracuse gave me a lot of insight into directing the Comedy of Errors. And for those of you that saw it, it had 5 songs in it, original composition. They were all different styles. They were really in the style of Boys from Syracuse, that they were to savor the moment. They were not to move the plot along. And, I think Shakespeare in comedy is one of the hardest things. And if you look very deeply at the script of the Comedy of Errors, I'm going to say something controversial, but it's actually not that funny. So you've got to invent a whole physical and emotional life for the play to make it funny. And that's, interestingly enough, what George Abbott did in 1938. And there is actually only one line of Shakespeare in The Boys from Syracuse, which is the abbess says in the play, but the CRS says, "The venom clamors of a jealous woman poisons more deadly than a mad dog's tooth." So I'll leave my Shakespeare right there.
Well, and we can blame Plautus, right, for it not being funny, perhaps, because Shakespeare he's adapting the Menechmi by Plautus. So it's sort of his version of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, where he's taking this old Plautus Roman comedy and trying to punch it up and make them laugh, make it funny. Historical question for you, Ted. I'm wondering if you can answer this. What about Gilbert and Sullivan? The richness of Shakespeare is what makes his works endure. And isn't the same true of Gilbert and Sullivan? Where do they figure into this conversation about opera, musical theater, and this kind of legacy? Because many people have made the connection between Gilbert and Sullivan and Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I have a smart answer to that. I will say that I think it's kind of fascinating, although some people disagree with me on this, that Gilbert and Sullivan is kind of passed out of fashion. I know my parents, who were pretty enlightened New York, theater and art folk, didn't like Gilbert and Sullivan and never took my brothers and me to it. By the way, I'm a twin as well, so we have a lot of twins here.
I am also a twin, by the way.
Well, okay, everybody else?
Natasha and Ben, get off the call.
Right. No, but I mean, it is interesting when a team like Gilbert and Sullivan who create their own world that is so specific, and they just mine it, show after show after show. As I guess one could say Shakespeare did that, one could say Rodgers and Hammerstein did that as well. There's an interest in the variations within a theme. that all those artists choose to grab a hold of and deal with in different ways.
Another question
Sort
for
of
the
answers
group
the question.
from Nancy and Jack Garden. No, I think that's very interesting, Tevin. I agree that it does seem like Gilbert and Sullivan maybe is becoming a little bit more of a thing of the past, or a little bit more of a specialist thing. Does anyone have an opinion on the Shakespeare musical Something Rotten? Our viewer wants to know. Has anybody been in Something Rotten? Do they know the piece? I know nothing about the piece. So
I saw it. I thought it was funny. I thought it's a fresh take, and there's some very funny moments in it and great performances all around. I think that the writing was very clever. It's original, which you never get on Broadway, rarely get on Broadway. So I won't besmirch them for that. That's what I have to say about it.
Yeah, I also think a knowledge of Shakespeare was helpful to the enjoyment of Something Rotten, but only a little more helpful because it was cast with a bunch of clowns, and there were enough things. If you knew a very little bit about Shakespeare, you could get a lot of the jokes. But it was certainly not an adaptation of Shakespeare, but it certainly was. It was set in the world of Shakespeare.
So it's maybe more of a meta text, right? Referring to the universe of Shakespeare, a little bit like Wicked is a kind of takeoff from Wizard of Oz and L. Frank Baum's universe in that sense, right? It's written for a postmodern, ironic, knowing audience.
Yes, I think that's accurate, and the cast was great.
The cast was fantastic. I don't think there was any knowledge of Shakespeare needed to go in and enjoy it.
Right, which is, I think, the trick with those shows is that it should work great if you're, just off the bus from the provinces in New York and you want to see a show, and also if you're a hardcore musical theater or Shakespeare nerd.
I think that that's what. Anytime you start talking about these art forms that have become a little bit guarded by a certain status of people, you know what I mean? Whether you're talking about opera or you're talking about Shakespeare, things that had started off as art forms for the people and of the people and for the greater public, pop art basically. And at some point in time, they became co-opted by the elite or people with money or only with a social status or an education to enjoy them. And anything and kind of like what I've enjoyed about, I've done some opera, but it's only been opera that's been geared towards bringing in audiences that are more general audiences. And I think that anytime you can do it with Shakespeare, which I know you guys have done, which is great with the musicals, because it's a way of introducing audiences who don't normally go to Shakespeare and kind of breaking down the barriers for that.
And I think the most ironic thing, and this is off of what Ben said and something Ted said earlier, is besides Kiss Me Kate, none of these things which we consider the most faithful adaptations have any Shakespeare in them. I mean, no one could say, everyone could say that that West Side Story is the most faithful adaptation of the Romeo and Juliet story for our times, but not a word of Shakespeare is in it. Same is really true for Syracuse, and Kiss Me Kate is the one anomaly. But it is really about two actors working out the problems of their relationship through the meta text of doing a production of Taming of the Shrew. And so everything that happens in the Shrew is really about what's happening to them off stage. So that is really the exception to the rule.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about off and on as we've been doing the Shakespeare Hour. I call it the Kurosawa effect. How you can have this paradox of a Japanese film with not a line of Shakespeare in it that feels like a completely authentic adaptation of King Lear or the Scottish play. And I think it is because of what all three of our guests and Alan, you've been saying, is that it's the stories, stupid. It's the fact that Shakespeare was a great dramatist, a great pop artist who knew how to entertain people. He was not just a poet. He was not somebody to be read in a literary sense. He was somebody to experience live in a theater. I'm antsy to get to like some more discussion of these specific works and to hear some songs. But I think first, Gordon, we have a special video message that we would like to share with our audience members from Simon, updating us on what he's doing in London. So if we have that video ready, let's go to Simon now.
Hello. Well, my name is Simon Godwin. I'm the artistic director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company, and I'm sending you my first postcard from England. Yes, I'm here in London's National Theatre rehearsing for a film of Romeo and Juliet, which is part resourced by PBS, and so the film of Romeo and Juliet is going to be shown in America in the spring. So every week I'm going to be giving you an update about how it's going, and every week I'm going to be welcoming someone to join me from the cast or crew, and today I have with me the producer of Romeo and Juliet and a native of Washington, D.C., David Sable. Hello, David.
Hello, Simon.
David, thank you for joining me. My first special guest star on the postcard from London. You're producing the movie of Romeo and Juliet, but before that, you grew up in Washington, and am I right that you actually even attended the theatre?
I attended the theatre, all the theatres of Washington many times, but especially the Shakespeare Theatre. I was a season ticket holder from the age of probably 11 to 18 till I left for university.
That's terrific. So one of our youngest season ticket members.
Probably, yeah. I started going at a very early age because I always loved the theatre, and so did my parents. And obviously then it was only at the Landsberg, the one space. And, oh God, I mean, it's going back a while now, but I have very fond memories of a production of Macbeth with Stacey Keach and Tom Hulce in Hamlet, and Kelly McGillis in... I want to say Hedda Gabler, and maybe, anyways, and also I think The Merry Wives of Windsor or something. Anyways, there's lots of them, but yeah, I have very, very many happy memories.
That's amazing. And so we could talk about your career up to now, David, because you are really the founder of NT Live, which is an incredible achievement. And I know many of our viewers have had the chance to enjoy NT Live so much over the years. But here we're on the just before embarking on a new national lockdown, and yet under your great guidance we still are here in this room rehearsing the film of Romeo and Juliet, which starts shooting at the beginning of December. How's it going, David, from your perspective?
Oh, it's been a really exciting week because we now have you here with us. Thank you, Washington, for letting him come over. But really because the actors arrived, and there's always that moment on the first day when the actors arrive and you've been spending months talking about something and planning, and this has been quite a compressed process. And will it happen? Won't it happen? How will it happen? How do we do it in a safe way? But we found those ways through. And so to see the actors arrive and kind of begin to speak the words and begin to discover the text felt very exciting. There was a great energy in the room, and I think it's going really, really well. What's really exciting, as you say, is what we're doing is something totally new and totally different, and we're very lucky that even as we are going into a lockdown, and very sadly the theatres have to shut again, but film and TV work is allowed to continue, and even rehearsal work in preparation for a later opening is allowed to continue. So we've created what we think is a very safe environment, very, very kind of careful thought and measures have gone into that, but at the same time it's an environment where one still has to take creative risk, and that's what I hope you're going to be doing, and I know you are, and I think we're in really, really good shape, and I just can't wait to make something again.
Well, thank you, David. That's wonderful. Creative risk. That's such a good phrase, and that's very much what we're involved in. And you're creating an incredibly positive and energetic atmosphere. And it's great that I'm still in touch with the spirit of DC through your good self, and of course through all of you. So look, that's the postcard from England. I know it's time to hand you back to Shakespeare.
Election day. It's election day.
It's going up tomorrow. Oh, come on. Anyway, my thanks to David. Creative risk is absolutely the way forward, and I'm going to hand you back to Drew and to our amazing guests for you to continue to explore Shakespeare, and indeed Shakespeare and the musical. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And thank you, Simon, for that smooth transition, as always. Well, let's talk about Boys from Syracuse. 1938, as you were saying, Alan. It's Rodgers and Hart, right? So it's before the team up of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Is there any way you'd like to set up this clip, or maybe Ted or Ben, having been in our concert performance of Boys from Syracuse?
Well, I'll dive in to say that it is said that this was the first Broadway musical based on Shakespeare. There was something I read that gave a little wiggle room to that, so there may have been something not that significant before, and maybe one of your viewers will chastise us for saying that. But that is what people said, And one of the clips that I asked to play is just an amusing thing that shows how much of Shakespeare the people who put it together were willing to admit to. But also, I will say that not only did I see the production at the Harmon Theater with several of these people, but it was when I reminded myself of who was in the cast, it was an absolutely astonishing group of people, and it was great fun. And it didn't feel like you only had 3 days of rehearsal, Alan.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was my first year at the theater, and it was in some ways our first entree into doing musical theater at the Shakespeare Theater. Was it not?
Yeah, before we produced any musicals, we did a season of Shakespeare-inspired concerts, and the other one was The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which Amanda Daner directed.
You know, the funny thing about this, though, is that we showed up, and Natasha can speak to this as well. We show up and we're told, it's like encores in New York, where you're told, yes, show up and it's going to be script in hand and it's going to be great. And then you get in there and you have the ever ambitious Alan Paul, who's like, okay, drop the scripts, memorize this in 3 days. We're going to do full choreography. I'm not a dancer. Natasha's one of the most beautiful dancers you'll ever see. And I had to do like a little thing with her. So it's a credit to people more able than you being able to lead you and push the envelope.
Ben, all I will say is that Leslie Kritzer and Michael McGraw came off book. Ben.
Wow.
You know what though? And where did their careers go? Honestly, where did their careers go?
Okay, so I believe we have an audio clip of the prologue, and then we have a little video clip of the City Center Encores production. So Gordon, if we're ready, let's go to those clips.
This is a drama of ancient Greece.
It is a story of mistaken identity.
If it's good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for us.
God, that swings. God, that swings. Yes.
Also, I'm glad to show that, because that's Debbie Gravitt Sarah, you were actually buried the great Rebecca Luker. And it's funny because, those three, to do that trio with people of that caliber, as you were, Leslie Kritzer, Betsy Wolfe, and Anastasia Barzee, I mean, it's like, it just attracts people of that caliber. And also just a little sort of musical theater note. The great Hugh Martin, who was a great vocal arranger and composer, came to New York in the 30s and was introduced to Richard Rodgers. And basically, he said, what show are you working on? And Rodgers said, well, I'm doing this thing based on Shakespeare. And he said, well, I would love to work on it. And Rodgers handed Hugh Martin the song Sing for Your Supper, and he wrote that arrangement. And it became kind of a classic for that kind of close harmony arrangement that, got through the 30s and the 40s. So, but it really, and obviously when Rodgers first heard it, he thought, that's pretty good.
When it does feel very characteristic of that, it feels like it really embodies that era in a way. It's very fun. It's a very fun early. It's different from, I think, Kate and West Side in the sense that it's not super reverential about Shakespeare.
Oh.
It's very much a contemporary popular approach.
Right. That's also why I thought starting with Michael McGraw and Mario Cantone saying, if it's good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for us. I mean, that's basically 1938 musical comedy. I always think that those musical comedies of that era were the sitcoms of their day. It's like, let's do one on Shakespeare. Let's do one about dancing, ballet dancing. They're all sort of ideas that just, they just dreamt up and they said, well, let's just do it and crank it out. And little did they know that we would look back on it these many years later and realize, wow, a lot of those are really, really good.
Yeah, and the same irreverence that Shakespeare himself had for Plautus and for Seneca and for his contemporaries,
Exactly.
Rewriting the Spanish tragedy as Hamlet. Kiss Me Kate seems like it's a slightly different enterprise because Porter, of course, his heyday was in the 1930s with these kind of sitcom-y, jazzy, comic type pre-book musicals. And then Kiss Me Kate comes at a later period in his career, correct? When he's sort of self-consciously catching up with what Rodgers and Hammerstein are doing in the 40s.
Yeah, and it's interesting, he collaborated with a great female writer named Bella Spewak, and there was an article that came out about the writing of the show, and she was first approached to do a musical of The Taming of the Shrew, and she basically turned it down, and then she got the idea with the producer of doing the play within a play. And if you go back to some of her original letters, she wanted Kate to be a very different kind of strong woman than Kate in The Taming of the Shrew, or Lily Vanessy. And she had a lot of conflict with both Cole Porter and the producer about how to do that. And so one thing I wanted to take us through today is this question of how do you do an old musical or an old piece that has different ideas about gender than we have today. And I think it's so interesting to work on Shakespeare because you can take Shakespeare's text and you can add a different kind of subtext and really contextualize it in a different way. And so this was a conversation that I had about doing the piece when I did it at the Shakespeare Theater in 2015. I did it with Douglas Sills, and then I had the real pleasure and fun of doing it again at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle with Ben Davis playing Petruchio. And it was very interesting how in 2015 and 2018, that was quite a different experience in what the audience wanted from the show. And 2017 was the Me Too movement. So I thought I would just take just a very short time to walk you through a couple lines of Kate's speech, I Am Ashamed That Women Are So Simple, the final 5 lines to show you how Shakespeare put it, how it was done in the 1999 revival, and then a little bit more about the revision that was done 2 years ago. So in the Shakespeare play, the final 5 lines that Kate says, "Then veil your stomachs, for it is no boot, and place your hands below your husband's foot, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready, may it do him ease." And so, Gordon, I'd love you to now cue up Marin Maisie doing just that final piece of singing in the 1999 revival.
So why hold your temper and meekly put
And although it has a beautiful ending, that's when Maren Maisie did this enormous wink to the audience to let them know that she was in on the joke. But it was very interesting to stage that in 2018. And I had a hard time doing it because the audience had a different experience. So a year later, when it was revived on Broadway, they had a really interesting idea that they would change the song to be, I am ashamed that people are so simple. And Amanda Green, who's the daughter of Adolph Green, just had a very slight change to the lyrics. And we're just gonna play you Kelly O'Hara singing that final piece from the song. So Gordon, you can take it away.
So mates, hold your temper and humbly put your hand neath the sole of your lover's foot, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready, ready. May it do him ease.
Well, I think just not to open a can of worms about that, but I think it's such an interesting thing to be a director of musicals and Shakespeare, because in Shakespeare you're free to reinterpret it, you're free to cut it, you're free to change it, and that is what directors do to make it relevant for now. And a lot of directors, I think, do Shakespeare quite a big disservice, and it's such a different experience. And I know, Ted, you have been so a part of this process. When a director comes to a classic musical and they want to make changes, and of course, if there is an estate for the writers or if there's family present, what is it like, Ted, what is the process you go through when you're deciding what can be changed, what can't? I'm just so curious about that.
Well, to me, it's always a conversation, and it depends on the circumstances. And since the families no longer have anything to do with the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows or the Rodgers and the Hart ones, because they sold it all, so now, in some ways, the responsibility falls on our shoulders, those of us who are there by day. But I always feel, because my early career was working actually in the theater, I feel as if I have an understanding of what you are all going through. So I will always want to hear and be convinced, give me the idea, convince me that this idea is good. I also, the other thing I should say is, in the job that I've been lucky to have for a long time, there's a volume of work. So if one it doesn't work out, there are others that I don't envy the people who have only one show, and how, what are you going to do to Finian's Rainbow? Because if you mess it up, that's going to be it for another cycle. So that's, I'll listen, and I will say to any artist, convince me. The Oklahoma that was on Broadway a year or so ago was absolutely fascinating, and that, from the very, very beginning, Gideon Lester, who is the producer, came and said, this is what we want to do. It's a communal event. They're cooking chili in the first act, and everybody eats it at intermission. And it was like, really? But that's where it started. Again, that idea started. And the more I can be kept in the dialogue, from my standpoint, the better.
It's so interesting, Alan, just listening to that, those two different deliveries of that same phrase. I mean, I'm someone who is a purist about things, as much as I like Ted, who is guarding these pieces, and they're ushering in through time. I'm not afraid of adhering to whatever the richness, because if that was what their constraints were in that time, then that is what they're, it's like, deal with it. Part of me can't stand people always bringing the material to them. How do I relate to me? It's not about you. This is about that time. And these are the realities that these people had to live with. But in terms of an interpretive discussion, what I heard, and maybe I have it wrong, Kelly's and those changes, those two changes of those two words, it's really sort of like the metaphor of like, well, if a man and a woman are going to make love, you know, a woman has to let him, right? so there is that sort of like, my hand is ready, you know, my hand is, you know, my whatever I can offer you is ready. So as opposed to like, you know, this subject is only about being supplicant to your husband, you know, with a wink, which is equally as fun and has currency depending on the, you know, the world of your show. But it's interesting. And that second one, I heard a lot more metaphoric. It was used metaphorically to me.
It's also interesting to hear it after the Boys from Syracuse clips, and the style of the music and the reverential attitude towards Shakespeare, this kind of mock Renaissance harpsichord style.
Yes, yeah, that's cute. Yeah.
It feels very self-consciously classical, and also using Shakespeare's own language in the song, setting Shakespeare's words. Obviously, we could talk, this is a huge, you know, subject, and we could talk for an entire episode about the ethics of performing certain plays in a post-Me Too era, and how do you change them? How do you accommodate them? How do you soften them for a contemporary audience, or are you betraying the work in doing so?
Right, right.
Do we think that as a culture we've moved from, and Alan and I had so much fun trying to parse all this out, because I'm like Natasha, I'm like, do we think that as a culture we've moved from being able to speak in metaphors and speak in, you know, to a more literal thing? So when people say my hand is ready beneath your foot or whatever like that, people will read into that very literally, whereas that's not what it meant, and there's a deeper level to that. But we're so used as a society being spoon-fed things that we no longer use any critical thinking. We never use any sort of like, oh no, this is what they meant. We're just used to, and that's where I think Shakespeare can help us is through that kind of language and that use of metaphor and that kind of imaginative language. I had an amazing English teacher in high school who always challenged us to see language and to see writing in different ways. And I think that's what Shakespeare gives us. And I'm afraid that we're losing that, especially in musical theater.
Well, I was saying at the break, it's the story's stupid. Shakespeare was an entertainer, but the flip side of that is he was also a poetic genius who found a way to work in image and metaphor on multiple levels of meaning. And sometimes they can't be parsed in a simple way, especially in a play like Taming of the Shrew, where gender and the performance of gender is a subject that he is interested in examining dramaturgically and not solving for the audience in an easy way.
You know, I'm also just thinking of, because I know Alan directs opera as well. And of course, I'm just thinking of my dad's Otello with Zeffirelli's Otello, and how these composers dealt with that text. I mean, it is similar, right? I mean, Alan, you would know this more than me, but yeah, just all of those dynamics between the characters, musicalized in the orchestra.
And to add to what you said, Natasha, before we hear our final clip, none of them tried to bite off the whole play. They found 3 to 4 acts of what was truly essential. And they, Verdi and all the opera composers were even shrewder than some of the musical theater attempts at finding the essence of Shakespeare. And they truly changed plot points in a way that a lot of these musicals actually didn't.
It's interesting.
Ben, our final piece is from the Kiss Me Kate that you did in London with Alexandra Silber. And I'd love to hear what we're going to see.
I think we're going to play Were Thine That Special Face. It is set We did it at the Royal Albert Hall. Was part of the BBC Proms, which is an unbelievable summer series that the BBC puts on at Royal Albert Hall. And the fascinating thing about this is that you have the seats around. It's in the round basically, and there are seats, but then the whole orchestra level, the whole level, first level is standing room only, and these people will queue up in line that day, all for the whole day, and they pay, I think it was like £10 at the time or something like that. The fascinating thing is that the British are so attuned to language and everything that even during the long, and there's some very long dialogue moments in this, you could hear a pin drop, and they held on to every single word. So it was an experience that I will never forget. Anyways, that was it. And the orchestra is the John Wilson Orchestra, and John Wilson is he's a marvel, and it's one of the best orchestras, the best orchestra I've ever worked with.
Could I but see thy face?
Sir, why, it is a face like any other.
Aye, there's the rub. Were thine that special face, a face which fills my dreaming, were thine the rhythmed grace, were thine the form so lithe and slender, were thine the arm so warm, so tender, were thine the kiss divine, were thine the love for me, a love which fills my dreaming. When all these charms are thine, then you'll be mine, oh,
God, right before my dance break, I had a huge dance break that they just like totally cut off.
I want to hear the end of the song. Ben, you're one of the only true baritones left.
Yes, we're
Such a
dying to read.
beautiful tone. Such
Thank
a
you.
beautiful tone.
There was a review. Oh my God, I can't remember. He passed away now, and it was for Knickerbocker Holiday. What I'd done, they were like, Ben Davis is this great young baritone. Too bad there's no need for them in musical theater today. That was basically that's exactly what he said. It is true.
They said about altos too.
Yes.
It really does sound operatic in that arrangement with that orchestra.
Yeah. I mean that was the whole edition had been redone and it had gone back to the very original, because it's been changed so many times, and this was like a silver edition where they went back and did all the originals with every single bit of music that there was. And that was in the days when they had a principals, they had a singing course, and they had a dancing course, and it was really fantastic. All of the music was just so beautiful.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. Unfortunately, this has been an hour. We ran out of time, and we're not able to talk about West Side Story, which is perhaps the most operatic and ballaic. We will just have to have a special episode devoted.
Oh yes, and I will bring the clips. Trust.
Okay. I would have loved to see you do that, Natasha.
Well, I've got some clips. We've got some clips. I mean, it is the pinnacle of expression of this marriage, I think. I'm open, so you know where to find me. I'll be on that couch.
Even all the theaters come back.
I even do like live, I do little live stuff too. It's gonna be great. It's gonna sell out.
when all the theaters come back, and that would be a great episode, because it's a great piece to talk about, and also the revival, for those of you that have seen it on Broadway, has been a lightning rod, and something I really enjoyed, but that is really about this conversation that we're having tonight about how you reinterpret a beloved musical, show it respect, but also
Reinterpreting of pieces, yeah. And also what people will be wanting to see now. I mean, I think every theater is probably addressing this in its preparing for what's coming. And how can you not make this a part of this or any theatrical conversation these days? You know, what is coming? How are we going to meet the psyche of the people in our country and in this world who have been through this? And what will we meet them with to enrich them, to hold them, to inspire them, to reach them? You know, I think it's a huge, we're going to be talking about it and preparing for it for a long time.
Well, now we're giving you a sneak peek into our future episode on West Side Story. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for joining us. I certainly learned a ton tonight. I was entertained. I was thrilled. Ted, Ben, Natasha, Alan, it was wonderful having you as our guest. Finally, next week we are belatedly discussing Halloween with our episode on Shakespeare and the supernatural. Joining me will be guests Dr. Carol Levin, Dr. Martin Key Rogers Green, and actor Corey Stoll. So tune in for that. And for now, it is Drew Lichtenberg signing off.